fairly young. I was looking for something to do. I had a lot of invitations and offers for jobs, and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I met Jim Lane, and he described what his vision was for this great university, to try to have a mixture of academic learning and also on a foundation, a very deep and penetrating and permanent foundation of moral values. And that appealed to me very much. He also told me I could say what I wanted. I could meet with whom I chose. I could do what I wished on the campus. And I made him a promise that I had kept. He probably doesn't remember it, that I would always answer the questions I got from the students. Sometimes that gets me in pretty deep trouble answering questions. But I'm filling a position this afternoon on moral leadership or whatever it is that could best be addressed by Dr. Lane. So I'm going to do this with an adequate element of humility. Maybe adequate, I hope so. Anyway, I started off in Plains, Georgia. That's where I began my learning process. I lived in a rural area, about 2.5 miles west of Plains, which has now grown to 634 population. So we're steadily growing. We have about almost 2/3 African American and about 1/3 white people, and we have a harmonious community. The community in which I lived was called Archery, Georgia, and it was entirely African American, except for my neighbor's family. So I grew up surrounded by my black neighbors in a segregated society. And my basic moral values were shaped by my mother, who didn't pay any attention to racial mores or customs. And also, the most distinguished human being that I knew about when I was a child was an African Methodist Episcopal bishop named Dr. William Dexter Johnson. He was in charge of all the AME churches in 5 northern states. And when Bishop Johnson was going to be home for a weekend, it would be the front page of a local paper. Bishop Johnson will visit Archery this weekend. The church is still there, it's thriving, and St. Mark's AME Church. And Bishop Johnson would invite my father and mother and I and 2 sisters when they came along to come to church. And that's really where I heard a vision, an explanation of Christianity that I didn't get in the Plains Baptist Church. And I have to say that the most all-pervasive moral commitment of my life has been brought about by that disparity. I didn't really see it as a disparity then, but Bishop Johnson was the one who expressed, I would say, a much more accurate explanation of Christian values or the life and meaning of the teachings and actions of Jesus Christ than he did in my church. Because unanimously, we never had any visitor who come to Plains Baptist Church who didn't justify racial segregation. Some of them even dwell on the proper adherence to slavery that had existed 100 years earlier. And so I grew up in something of a dichotomy, but I didn't realize it at the time. It was just accepted. And the visitors to our church and the lawyers in America, the American Bar Association included, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Supreme Court, all agreed that racial segregation was okay. Separately. It's hard to believe now, but that's the way I grew up. My life was shaped by my neighbors. I wrote a book a number of years ago called An Hour Before Daylight. And at the end of the book, I decided to describe the 5 people who shaped my life, in addition to my mother and father. Only 2 of them were white. One was a high school principal, and the other was my daddy's brother. The other 3, Bishop Johnson was one of them. And the man is Rachel. And I describe Rachel as having the aura of a queen. She could have been King Solomon's daughter. She was a special person. And I won't go into details because it takes all morning, all afternoon, but I used to go fishing with Rachel on the days that we didn't work in the field. And on the way to and from the creek, just the two of us, she would describe to me what my relation should be with God and with human beings. And she would tell me that I was a steward of the earth and that I should know the names of the flowers and the trees and even the weeds along the way and the birds we saw. So I would say that Rachel was one that affected my life as much as anybody. My mother was a registered nurse. She spent most of her time nursing the black families in our community. The pay for a nurse in those days was $6 for 20 hours. So when mother was on duty, we didn't see her very much. She would come home at 10 o'clock at night, and she would wash her uniforms and leave a note to me and my sisters what to do the next day, and then she would go back on duty at 2 o'clock in the morning. So we didn't see Mom much. And when Dad was away on business, we spent the night with Rachel and Jack Paul. And I slept on the pallet on the floor. And Rachel would let me move my pallet near the fire during the cold nights. So you can see my life was affected by it. So that was the beginning of my realization of the blight or the millstone around the neck of my black neighbors who had inadequate schools, who had no right to vote, who could not serve on a jury, who took the last remaining jobs, and the white folks who took advantage of this. Even a few that deplored the situation didn't want to disturb it too much because they benefited from all the advantages that accrued to them. Well, those are the things that happen. But the point I want to make to this class from Canada is that I didn't get any guidance from white preachers who were not particularly interested in changing their own privileged position. They were exalted in our community. They were looked upon as at the top of the social and professional order. There was no distinction in our schools between the church and education. Every morning we started out with 30 minutes of chapel, where we spent most of our time singing hymns and reciting Bible verses. And that was the beginning of our daily school day. And so that was the environment for which I came. I went into the Navy. That was my preference. And it was in the Navy in 1948. I was a submarine officer, where I first experienced the practical effect of racial integration, because Harry Truman, who's not very often mentioned as a civil rights hero, was the one who changed that relationship in our country. This was 7 or 8 years before Rosa Parks sat in the front of a bus on Martin Luther King Jr. became famous. Harry Truman ordained as the commander-in-chief that in the U.S. Navy, where I was, and in the Army and the Marines and the Coast Guard and the Civil Service, there would be no more distinction between black and white people. And I saw the benefit of it. So that was the first glimmer of a change in basic moral values that shaped or affected my life. There were other moral values, of course, peace and other things like that. But the ones that affected my life, I learned from, I would say, an African-American woman and a president who's not been recognized for his contribution. Well, when I ran for governor of Georgia later on, much later, I was with a Jewish man whose name is David Rabhan. He let me fly around with him and plane. It helped me a lot in my campaign. And at the end of the campaign, I was flying from Brunswick, Georgia to Newnan, Georgia. In his plane, he was asleep. I was flying the plane. I didn't take off and land, but I could handle it. And we were about 30 minutes out of Newnan, and both engines quit. And I was shocked. I screamed, David, David. He pretended to be asleep. And I jabbed him with my left elbow and almost knocked him out of his seat. And he finally pretended to wake up, and he reached down and switched to a valve that turned the gasoline on, so the engine started. I said, David, you've done a lot for me. What can I do for you? And he said, do you have a piece of paper? And I said, yeah. I looked around, and all I could find was a little state of Georgia aerial map that pilots use. I said, I could write on this. He said, write down what I want you to say at your inauguration. And he said, the time for racial discrimination is over. So I wrote it down. And later, when I made my 8-minute inaugural speech, I said, I've traveled this state as much as anyone who's ever lived. And I tell you quite frankly, the time for racial discrimination is over. That was in 1971. Quite late in the process. Well, that's just part of my things. But I decided then that if I became president, which I did, as some of you may know, that human rights or civil rights, whatever you want to call it, would be the foundation of my party. So I tried to emphasize it. And that's one of the elements of moral values about which I wanted to talk about. We've gone a long way. I'm going to spend most of my time answering your questions, but I wanted to just cover one more thing that's been kind of a child of that, or descendant of that, or a result of that effort. And that is what we are doing now at the Carter Center. The Carter Center is a partner with Emory, a full partner established by Jim Laney and me. Half of our trustees come from Emory, half of them come from us, and we have equal rights on the board. And the final decisions are made by half Emory and half Carter Center people. We don't know who's what. But that's important. But one of the things that we do at the Carter Center is emphasize still human rights. And for the last 3 years, we've discussed the worst human rights abuse on earth. And that is the deprivation of basic human rights of women and girls. This is a blight on the human race that is much greater even than was slavery or racial discrimination. And we now find that one of the major causes of this human rights abuse is a misinterpretation of religious scriptures. You can go through the 34,000 or so verses in the Bible, as all as you know, and you can pick out ones that will confirm your superiority in life. And almost half the people on earth, men, they want to be superior. So I'd say after the 3rd century of Christianity, the white men took over. And they have now interpreted the scriptures. Many of them have that in the eyes of God, men are superior. And women should be subservient. And the women were the cause of the downfall of humanity. When the woman accepted the apple from the snake, and Christians emphasize the 2nd chapter in Genesis, as you know, that women were created after men were, from Adam's rib. There's a different interpretation in the 1st chapter. But because of those misinterpretations of Christian